The long gallery at Windermere possessed that particular quality of English country houses where generations had layered beauty upon necessity until the distinction between them had become pleasantly blurred. On this grey October afternoon, the room had been transformed from its customary role as a repository of ancestral portraits into a makeshift theatre, though the watching faces in their gilded frames seemed to suggest that drama was hardly foreign to these walls. The Persian carpets had been rolled back with ceremonial care by Blackwood, the butler, whose 40 years of service had taught him to treat such disruptions as temporary accommodations, rather than genuine alterations to the natural order. Lady Windermere herself presided from a Chippendale chair positioned with strategic precision near the marble fireplace, her silver hair arranged with the sort of understated perfection that spoke of both breeding and a lady's maid of exceptional competence. She observed the proceedings through her gold-rimmed lorgnette with the air of one accustomed to command, though those familiar with her particular manner might have detected a certain tension in the way her gloved fingers worried at the rope of pearls that had belonged to 3 generations of Windermere ladies before her. The occasion was the final rehearsal of Winter's Grace, a brief masque of Lady Windermere's own devising, created for the annual charity performance that had become something of a tradition in the county. Tomorrow evening, the drawing-room would welcome the better families from a radius of 20 miles, all gathered in the name of the local hospital fund, though the social implications of the evening extended far beyond mere philanthropy. "No, Daphne, my dear." Lady Windermere's voice carried that particular quality of gentle authority that brooked no argument while maintaining perfect courtesy. Lady Cordelia's entrance must suggest winter's reluctant surrender to spring. Think of morning frost yielding to sunlight, gradual, inevitable, but with a certain dignified resistance. Miss Daphne Ashford, who possessed the sort of ethereal beauty that photographed beautifully in the society papers and acted with competent if uninspired adequacy, paused in her movement across the improvised stage. She was the daughter of the local magistrate, blessed with classical features and that particular combination of modest fortune and social ambition that made her simultaneously desirable and slightly calculating in the marriage market. "Perhaps," she murmured, her voice carrying just the faintest note of uncertainty, "if I were to enter from behind the Chinese screen rather than the doorway, the effect might be more mysterious." The suggestion came from Dr. Helena Marsh, whose arrival in the neighbourhood 3 months previous as the new village physician had caused considerable discussion in drawing-rooms throughout the county. She was a woman of perhaps 35, with intelligent dark eyes and the quiet confidence that came from having earned her place in a world not entirely prepared to welcome her professional aspirations. Her presence at Windermere represented something of a social experiment on Lady Windermere's part, a gesture toward modernity that was both genuine and carefully calculated. "How thoughtful of you, Doctor," Lady Windermere replied, her smile maintaining its warmth while her eyes suggested that unsolicited directorial advice was perhaps not entirely welcome. "Though I suspect the traditional approach serves our purposes adequately. We must remember that our audience expects certain conventions." The exchange carried the sort of polite tension that characterized the better class of English disagreement, each word weighted with implications that extended far beyond the immediate question of theatrical staging. Dr. Marsh inclined her head gracefully and retreated to her position near the music stand, where she stood beside Mrs. Cordelia Fairfax, the rector's widow, whose involvement with the performance stemmed less from dramatic ambition than from a genuine desire to remain useful in her declining years. At the pianoforte, positioned strategically to catch the afternoon light, sat Mr. Geoffrey Harrington, whose arrival at Windermere the previous spring had been explained as research for a book on rural architecture, though his extended residence suggested either remarkable dedication to scholarship or an arrangement with his publishers that bore closer examination. He possessed the sort of carefully maintained appearance that spoke of reduced circumstances gracefully borne, and fingers that moved across the keys with the precision of a gentleman's education and the necessity of recent practice. The male lead had fallen to Captain James Stratton, recently returned from service in India with a modest pension, and the sort of upright bearing that made him attractive to hostesses in need of extra men for dinner parties. He was a pleasant-looking gentleman of perhaps 30, whose diffidence in civilian society contrasted markedly with what one suspected had been considerable competence in military matters. His obvious admiration for Miss Ashford provided a subplot to the afternoon's proceedings that was not entirely confined to the scripted performance. "Shall we attempt the recognition scene once more?" suggested Lady Windermere, consulting the small leather-bound notebook in which she had recorded her directorial observations. "Captain Stratton, do remember that Lord Aubrey's realization of Lady Cordelia's true identity should come as a revelation, not merely a confirmation of what the audience has already surmised." As the scene recommenced, the afternoon light filtering through the tall windows began to take on that particular quality of English autumn. Golden, but somehow melancholy, as if aware of its own transience. The shadows lengthened across the Aubusson carpet, and the fire, in the grate, settled into the sort of steady glow that would be needed as evening approached. It was then that Blackwood appeared in the doorway with the sort of measured discretion that characterised 40 years of superior service. He was a man whose long tenure at Windermere had earned him not only Lady Windermere's complete confidence, but also a certain authority within the household that transcended his official position. His presence now, during the sacred hour of rehearsal, suggested a matter of some importance. "I beg your pardon, your ladyship," he murmured, his voice pitched to carry just far enough, "but there has been a telephone call. From London. Rather urgent, I'm afraid." The mention of London cast a subtle shadow over the assembled company. Lady Windermere's expression suggested that urgent telephone calls were a modern intrusion she tolerated rather than welcomed, particularly when they interrupted the delicate work of artistic creation. "Can it not wait, Blackwood? We are at rather a crucial juncture in the proceedings." "I fear not, your ladyship." The caller was most insistent. "Something regarding tomorrow evening's arrangements, and a matter that requires your immediate attention." As Lady Windermere rose with the sort of graceful resignation that suggested both annoyance and acceptance of life's inevitable interruptions, the easy rhythm of rehearsal began to fracture. Conversation started and stopped, glances were exchanged, and the comfortable fiction that they were all simply friends gathered for an amusing afternoon began to show its carefully concealed cracks. Dr. Marsh moved to examine one of the portraits that lined the gallery walls, a particularly fine example of 18th century portraiture, whose subject seemed to regard the modern proceedings with amused tolerance. Captain Stratton approached Miss Ashford with the sort of careful attention that suggested conversations beyond the merely theatrical. Mr. Harrington continued to play softly, his music providing a gentle counterpoint to the murmured discussions that had replaced the formal rehearsal. The afternoon light continued its gradual retreat, and somewhere in the distance a door closed with the sort of finality that seemed to echo through the gracious rooms of Windermere House. The rehearsal would resume, of course, and tomorrow's performance would proceed according to plan. But in that moment of suspension, as the company waited for Lady Windermere's return, there was something in the air, a tension that went beyond the ordinary anxieties of amateur theatricals, a sense that the real drama had yet to begin. Outside, the first leaves of autumn drifted past the tall windows, and within the gallery the watching portraits seemed to lean forward slightly, as if anticipating a performance far more compelling than the gentle masque that had brought this particular assembly together on this particular afternoon at Windermere House. The interval of Lady Windermere's absence stretched beyond the comfortable boundaries of polite expectation, and the assembled company found themselves suspended in that peculiar state of social limbo where the organising principle has withdrawn, leaving only the delicate machinery of good breeding to maintain the appearance of ease. The rehearsal, which had possessed its own momentum and gentle authority, began to fragment into smaller conversations and private preoccupations, each member of the cast gravitating toward their natural alliances with the sort of careful casualness that masks genuine uncertainty. Captain Stratton, with the compact economy of movement that spoke of years spent in circumstances where idleness was a luxury rather than a social necessity, found himself drawn to one of the tall windows that faced the park. There was something in his posture, a stillness that suggested watchfulness rather than mere contemplation. That caught Dr. Marsh's attention as she moved from her examination of the ancestral portraits. She approached with the measured discretion that characterised her professional manner, recognising in him the particular tension of a man accustomed to action, who finds himself constrained by the more subtle demands of drawing-room society. "Remarkable how the light changes at this time of year," he observed, his reflection in the glass showing a face that had learned to school its expressions to civilian requirements. In India, the transitions were more decisive. Here, everything seems to fade by degrees, as if apologising for its own necessity. Dr. Marsh studied his profile with the clinical attention that her training had made second nature. Perhaps that's what makes English melancholy so particularly refined. We've learned to appreciate the gradual diminishment of things, to find beauty in decline itself. She paused, noting the slight tension around his eyes that suggested concerns extending beyond the immediate circumstances. You must find the adjustment rather more complex than anticipated. His laugh carried a note of rueful acknowledgement. More than I had prepared for, certainly. Military life, for all its hardships, operates on principles of clarity. Civilian society requires a different sort of navigation. One learns to read the spaces between words, the implications of what remains unsaid. Their conversation was punctuated by the soft, persistent notes from the pianoforte, where Mr. Harrington continued to play with that particular absorption that musicians achieve when their conscious attention has wandered elsewhere. The melody, which had earlier served as a gentle accompaniment to their theatrical preparations, now possessed a more introspective quality, as if reflecting the subtle shift in the room's atmosphere. Miss Ashford emerged from behind the Chinese screen where she had been arranging her costume, her movements carrying that carefully maintained grace that spoke of years spent perfecting the art of appearing effortlessly elegant. Yet there was something in her expression, a tightness around her mouth that suggested impatience imperfectly concealed, that indicated the prolonged interruption had tested her social training more severely than she cared to admit. "I do hope Lady Windermere returns presently," she murmured, accepting the cup of tea that Mrs. Fairfax had thoughtfully prepared from the service Blackwood had provided with his customary foresight. "There are several passages in tomorrow's performance that require her particular guidance, and I confess I grow rather anxious when details remain unsettled." Mrs. Fairfax, whose long experience with parish theatricals had taught her the value of practical optimism in the face of artistic uncertainty, smiled with gentle reassurance. "Lady Windermere is far too conscientious to leave us in genuine difficulty. Whatever matter has claimed her attention, she will resolve it with her characteristic efficiency." As if summoned by their speculation, Lady Windermere's step could be heard approaching along the corridor, though her return brought with it an atmosphere subtly different from her earlier departure. When she entered the gallery, her composure remained intact, yet there was something in the set of her shoulders, the slightly more deliberate quality of her movements, that suggested the telephone conversation had proven more taxing than mere inconvenience. "A tiresome matter," she announced, her voice maintaining its customary authority, while betraying none of the underlying strain that those who knew her well might have detected in the careful precision of her diction. "Something concerning the arrangements for tomorrow evening, a complication regarding the patron list that required immediate attention. One trusts it has been satisfactorily resolved." The explanation, delivered with Lady Windermere's characteristic blend of information and discretion, was accepted with the sort of polite attention that acknowledged both her right to privacy and their collective relief at her return. Yet as they resumed their positions for the continuation of rehearsal, there was a subtle alteration in the quality of their attention, a heightened awareness of each other and of the delicate social machinery that had brought them together in this particular configuration of relationships and obligations. "Now then," Lady Windermere continued, consulting her leather-bound notebook with renewed determination, "shall we proceed with the recognition scene? Captain Stratton, do remember that Lord Aubrey's realization must seem to dawn gradually, not a sudden revelation, but the slow emergence of understanding, like morning light revealing a familiar landscape transformed by snow." The scene recommenced, but with a different quality than before, more concentrated perhaps, yet touched with an undercurrent of uncertainty that had not been present in their earlier attempts. Mr. Harrington's accompaniment continued with its customary competence, though those listening carefully might have noted a slight alteration in tempo, a barely perceptible hesitation between phrases that suggested his attention was not entirely focused on the familiar music. It was Dr. Marsh who first noticed the change, not in the music itself, but in the musician. The slight pallor that had begun to settle over Harrington's features, the way his left hand seemed to require conscious direction, rather than moving with its usual fluid precision. Her professional training had taught her to observe such details, to note the small signs that often preceded larger developments. The recognition scene proceeded to its conclusion, Miss Ashford's performance achieving something approaching the graceful restraint that Lady Windermere had requested, when the music simply ceased. Not with the natural conclusion of a phrase, but with the abruptness of a mechanism that has suddenly failed to function. Mr. Harrington remained seated at the pianoforte, his hands still positioned over the keys, but with a stillness that transcended mere pause. "Mr. Harrington?" Lady Windermere inquired, her voice carrying that particular note of courteous concern that could, when necessary, serve as gentle reproof. Dr. Marsh was already moving, crossing the Aubusson carpet with the swift purposefulness that her profession had taught her to employ in moments when social niceties must yield to more pressing necessities. She reached the pianoforte and placed her fingers against Harrington's wrist, her expression growing grave as the seconds passed without the reassuring pulse she sought. When she looked up, meeting Lady Windermere's questioning gaze, her face carried the sort of professional composure that delivers unwelcome news with dignity rather than drama. "I'm afraid," she said quietly, "that Mr. Harrington is dead." The words settled over the gallery like the first snowfall of winter, silent, inexorable, transforming the familiar landscape of their afternoon into something altogether more complex and considerably more dangerous. Outside, the October wind stirred the remaining leaves against the windows, and within the gracious walls of Windermere House, the gentle fiction of their theatrical afternoon dissolved into the far more serious drama that had been waiting, with infinite patience, for precisely this moment to begin. The silence that settled over the gallery possessed that particular quality of shock which transforms familiar spaces into something altogether more complex and considerably more dangerous. It was Lady Windermere who recovered first, her breeding asserting itself with the sort of automatic precision that had been refined through generations of managing crises without sacrificing an ounce of dignity. She rose from her Chippendale chair with measured deliberation, her composure intact, though those who knew her well might have detected a subtle alteration in the way her gloved fingers had ceased their restless movement against her pearls. "Dr. Marsh," she said, her voice maintaining its characteristic authority, while acquiring that particular note of practical concern that distinguished genuine emergency from mere inconvenience. "Are you quite certain there can be no possibility of recovery?" Dr. Marsh remained beside the pianoforte, her professional attention focused on the still figure whose hands rested with peculiar formality upon the ivory keys. There was something almost ceremonial in Harrington's posture, as if death had arranged him with particular consideration for the dignity of his final performance. She conducted a second, more thorough examination with the methodical precision her training demanded, before turning to address the assembled company. "I'm afraid there can be no doubt," she replied, her words measured with the careful authority required when delivering certainty in circumstances that seemed to demand hope. "Mr. Harrington has been dead for several minutes. The manner appears to have been quite peaceful, a sudden cardiac event most likely, though naturally a proper examination will be required to determine the precise cause." Captain Stratton moved forward with that controlled efficiency which military service had made second nature, though his approach to the scene was tempered by the peculiar delicacy that civilian death seemed to require. His brief but thorough assessment carried the practical competence of a man accustomed to crisis, yet modified by an understanding that drawing-room tragedies demanded different protocols than those of the battlefield. "Lady Windermere," he said quietly, "I believe the proper authorities must be summoned without delay. In circumstances such as these, there are certain formalities that cannot be avoided." Miss Ashford had retreated to the window embrasure, her classical features maintaining their composure, though a slight tremor in her hands betrayed shock imperfectly controlled. Mrs. Fairfax approached her with the sort of gentle solicitude that years of parish work had refined into instinct, offering comfort through presence rather than words. The afternoon light, already fading toward dusk, seemed to drain from the room with each passing moment, leaving the assembled company suspended in that peculiar twilight state where ordinary social conventions must accommodate extraordinary circumstances. "Blackwood," Lady Windermere commanded, her voice carrying across the gallery with quiet authority. The butler materialized in the doorway with that mysterious promptness which superior servants cultivate, his expression maintaining its customary discretion, while his experienced eyes took in the altered situation with professional assessment. "Your ladyship, please telephone Dr. Morrison immediately and request his attendance as a matter of urgency. You will also contact the police. Captain Stratton is quite correct regarding the necessary protocols. And Blackwood, she added, her tone acquiring that particular inflection which established boundaries without seeming to impose them. I think it advisable that the gallery remain undisturbed until the appropriate authorities arrive. The 20 minutes that elapsed before official assistance materialized seemed to stretch with peculiar elasticity. The local constable who arrived first, a well-meaning young man whose familiarity with Windermere extended primarily to admiring its grounds from the public road, found himself somewhat overwhelmed by the combination of aristocratic authority and sudden death. His sergeant, more experienced in the delicate matter of investigating tragedy within the better circles, recognised immediately that the situation required handling of a rather more sophisticated nature than their usual rural concerns. It was therefore with considerable relief that they welcomed the arrival of Inspector Roderick Alleyn, whose presence in the district on an unrelated matter had been deemed providential by the local superintendent. Alleyn entered the gallery not with the brisk efficiency that characterised most police investigations, but with the quiet grace of a man whose experience had taught him that observation often yielded more valuable information than immediate interrogation. He was a tall, elegantly proportioned gentleman whose impeccably tailored clothing seemed to blend naturally with the muted tones of the room, suggesting a man equally comfortable in drawing rooms and crime scenes. His eyes, a remarkable shade of grey that seemed to shift between blue and green depending upon the light, held an intelligence that was both penetrating and remarkably gentle. When he spoke, his voice carried the cultured accents of a man whose education had been thorough and whose experience had been varied. "Lady Windermere," he said, offering a courteous bow that acknowledged both her position and the gravity of the circumstances, "I must apologise for this intrusion during what is clearly a most distressing time. I am Inspector Alleyn, and I have been asked to attend to this matter personally." Lady Windermere, who had been steeling herself for the sort of heavy-handed official investigation that her experience suggested was inevitable, found herself somewhat disarmed by Alleyn's quiet courtesy. "Inspector," she replied, inclining her head with gracious acknowledgement, "we are entirely at your disposal. This has been a most shocking occurrence." Alleyn moved through the gallery with deliberate care, his gaze taking in not merely the immediate scene, but the subtle details that spoke to the room's normal character and its current disruption. He noted the way the Persian carpets had been arranged to accommodate theatrical movement, the positioning of chairs that suggested both audience and performance space, the music stand with its scattered sheets bearing the evidence of interrupted rehearsal. His attention encompassed the ancestral portraits that lined the walls, their painted eyes seeming to observe the proceedings with the sort of eternal patience that only art achieves. When he finally approached the pianoforte, his examination was conducted with a methodical precision that missed nothing while disturbing as little as possible. He observed Harrington's peaceful posture, the natural positioning of his hands upon the keys, the slight inclination of his head that suggested a man who had simply ceased to exist between one note and the next. On the small table within reach of the piano stool, he noted the tea service that Mrs. Fairfax had arranged, the half-empty glass of water that Blackwood had provided, and the pencil that lay in the music desk's trough, blunted from use, and bearing the faint graphite smudges that spoke of a methodical musician's habits. "Dr. Marsh," Alleyn said, his voice pitched to carry just the appropriate distance. "You were first to attend Mr. Harrington?" "Yes, Inspector." I observed the cessation of his playing and moved immediately to assess his condition. There was no pulse, no response to stimulus. I would estimate he had been deceased for perhaps 2 or 3 minutes when I reached him. No signs of distress beforehand. No indication of illness or discomfort. Dr. Marsh considered the question with professional thoroughness. Nothing overt. His playing had been entirely competent throughout the afternoon, though. She paused, glancing toward the other members of the company. There had been some mention of recent sleeplessness, nothing that seemed medically significant at the time. Alleyn's gaze moved to encompass the assembled company, not with the aggressive scrutiny that might have been expected, but with the sort of quiet attention that invited confidence rather than defensiveness. He noted Captain Stratton's military bearing, the way he had positioned himself with strategic awareness near the doorway. He observed Miss Ashford's carefully maintained composure, the slight pallor that spoke of genuine shock rather than theatrical display. Mrs. Fairfax's gentle distress seemed entirely consistent with her character, while Lady Windermere's controlled authority suggested a woman accustomed to managing crises without losing her essential dignity. "If I might," Alleyn continued, his tone maintaining its courteous diffidence, "I should be grateful for a few moments to examine the scene more thoroughly before we proceed with the necessary formalities. Dr. Morrison will arrive presently to conduct the medical examination, but there are certain observations that are best made while the circumstances remain undisturbed." The request was phrased with such diplomatic courtesy that refusal seemed not merely impossible but somehow churlish. As Alleyn began his quiet investigation, moving with the sort of unobtrusive efficiency that suggested long practice in such matters, the company found themselves arranged as if for a performance far more demanding than the gentle mask that had brought them together. The real drama, it appeared, was only beginning to unfold within the gracious walls of Windermere House. Dr. Morrison's arrival brought with it the sort of brisk competence that rural medical practice had refined into both art and necessity. He was a gentleman of perhaps 60 years, whose long acquaintance with sudden death in its various country manifestations had taught him to approach such matters with professional thoroughness, tempered by social discretion. His examination of Mr. Harrington proceeded with quiet efficiency, conducted in consultation with Dr. Marsh in the sort of technical undertones that excluded the uninitiated while providing reassurance through their very expertise. "Natural causes, I should venture," Dr. Morrison observed to Inspector Alleyn, his voice pitched to carry the appropriate distance. "Cardiac arrest, by all appearances. The gentleman shows no signs of struggle or distress. Indeed, his posture suggests he simply ceased between one note and the next. A more thorough examination will naturally be required, but nothing in these circumstances suggests anything beyond tragic coincidence." Alleyn received this preliminary assessment with the sort of thoughtful attention that suggested neither complete acceptance nor immediate scepticism. His experience had taught him that natural death could accommodate a surprising variety of unnatural assistance, while circumstances that appeared suspicious often resolved into the most mundane of explanations. The art lay in maintaining an open mind while observing everything with equal care. As the necessary arrangements were made with that peculiar efficiency which superior households bring to crisis management, Alleyn began the delicate process of gathering information from the assembled company. He understood instinctively that in this particular stratum of society, direct interrogation would prove counterproductive. Information was more readily yielded through polite conversation, careful observation, and the subtle art of listening to what remained unsaid. The morning room, with its comfortable leather chairs and familiar portraits, provided an appropriately intimate setting for these discussions. Blackwood had thoughtfully arranged for fresh tea service, the gentle ritual of hospitality serving to ease the transition from social gathering to official inquiry. "Lady Windermere," Alleyn began, settling into the chair she indicated with gracious courtesy, "I must apologise for this intrusion during what is clearly a most distressing time. My objective is simply to understand the circumstances as thoroughly as possible, with minimal disruption to your household." Lady Windermere maintained her composure with the sort of practised grace that had been refined through generations of managing difficult situations without sacrificing dignity. "Inspector, we are entirely at your disposal. Mr. Harrington was a guest in my home, and his sudden passing is a source of profound concern. I only wish we could provide more immediate clarity regarding these tragic circumstances." Her account of the afternoon's events proceeded with meticulous chronology: the rehearsal's commencement, the interruption of the London telephone call, her brief absence, the resumption of their theatrical work, and finally the sudden cessation of music that had announced the tragedy. Yet Alleyn detected something in her manner, a slight hesitation before certain phrases, a tendency to glance toward the window during moments of reflection, that suggested considerations beyond the immediately apparent. "The telephone call," he ventured with careful delicacy, "was it connected in any way to Mr. Harrington or the evening's arrangements?" A barely perceptible tightening around her eyes preceded her response. "A tiresome matter concerning the patron list for tomorrow's performance, Inspector. A rather demanding benefactor requiring last-minute accommodation. Nothing that would have affected Mr. Harrington directly, though such interruptions are always regrettable when they disturb the delicate work of rehearsal." The explanation, delivered with Lady Windermere's characteristic authority, was accepted with courteous attention, though Alleyn noted the careful precision with which it had been constructed. neither more nor less information than strictly necessary. Captain Stratton, when invited to share his observations, brought to the conversation the sort of measured reliability that military service had refined into instinct. He settled into the designated chair with controlled precision, his bearing suggesting a man accustomed to providing clear, factual reports under circumstances of varying complexity. "You observed nothing unusual in Mr. Harrington's behaviour during the afternoon?" Alleyn inquired, his tone maintaining the conversational ease that transformed official inquiry into something resembling social discourse. "Nothing overt, Inspector. He seemed perhaps slightly fatigued, mentioned difficulty sleeping, though he attributed it to seasonal changes. His musical performance was entirely competent throughout the rehearsal. The cessation was quite sudden, without preliminary indication of distress." Stratton's response carried the careful neutrality of military training, yet his gaze tended to drift toward the gallery where Miss Ashford remained, suggesting preoccupations that extended beyond the immediate circumstances. Dr. Marsh, when her turn came, brought to the discussion the sort of clinical precision that medical training had refined into second nature. Her examination of events proceeded with professional thoroughness, yet something in her manner suggested observations that went beyond the purely medical. "Beyond the immediate tragedy," Alleyn observed, "did you notice anything else that struck you as unusual about Mr. Harrington's condition or behaviour?" She considered the question with careful attention to detail. "Only the suddenness, Inspector. There were no audible signs of distress, no discernible struggle. It was as if he simply stopped existing between one moment and the next. He had mentioned recent sleeplessness, but nothing that indicated immediate medical concern. His general health appeared robust, though there was something, a subtle alteration in his rhythm toward the end, barely perceptible hesitations that suggested preoccupation." Miss Ashford's interview revealed the sort of carefully controlled composure that spoke of emotions held in check through considerable effort of will. Her classical features maintained their serenity, yet there was a tension in her posture that suggested thoughts and feelings not entirely accessible to casual observation. "The nature of theatrical collaboration," she explained in response to Alleyn's gentle inquiries, "requires a certain awareness of one's fellow performers. Mr. Harrington's accompaniment was essential to proper execution of our scenes. One becomes attuned to variations in performance, subtle changes that might affect the overall effect. Today there seemed to be moments when his concentration wandered slightly, brief alterations in tempo that suggested his attention was not entirely focused on the music. Mrs. Fairfax, whose gentle manner concealed the sort of keen observation that years of parish work had developed, offered her impressions with characteristic kindness. Such a gentle soul, Mr. Harrington, always so obliging with village entertainments. His playing was quite accomplished. I did notice he seemed rather tired today, a touch pale, perhaps, but then, who wouldn't be, with the excitement of tomorrow's performance?" As these conversations proceeded, Alleyn found himself constructing not merely a chronology of events, but a map of relationships and tensions that had brought this particular assembly together. Each interview yielded its portion of information, yet the larger pattern remained tantalizingly incomplete, like a musical score with crucial measures missing. Returning to the gallery, he conducted his own quiet examination of the scene. The pianoforte remained as it had been left, its keys bearing the final impression of Harrington's hands. On the small table within reach, Alleyn noted the water jug that Blackwood had provided, positioned with the sort of careful precision that spoke to a servant's attention to routine. Yet the faint ring it had left upon the polished surface was placed slightly off-centre, as if it had been moved and replaced with less than perfect accuracy. The music itself told its own story. Sheets arranged with meticulous care, a pencil lying in the trough with its point-worn blunt from use, and on the topmost page, a faint smudge of graphite that seemed inconsistent with Harrington's reported precision. Small details, perhaps, but ones that suggested the afternoon's events might have been more complex than their elegant surface indicated. Blackwood, observing Alleyn's examination with the sort of professional interest that superior servants develop for matters affecting their households, approached with characteristic discretion. "Inspector," he murmured, his voice pitched for private conversation, "if there is any assistance I might provide regarding the household routines, the arrangements of the afternoon, I am entirely at your disposal." Alleyn looked up from his contemplation of the scene, meeting the butler's gaze with appreciation for the offer. "Mr. Blackwood, I suspect your observations of this household's daily rhythms might prove invaluable. When you're at leisure, I should be grateful for a conversation about the ordinary patterns, the times when doors are secured, when services are provided, when routines are established, and when they are altered." "Certainly, Inspector. After dinner would be convenient if that suits your requirements." As the October afternoon faded into dusk beyond the tall windows, Inspector Alleyn found himself confronting not merely the question of how Geoffrey Harrington had died, but the considerably more complex matter of why his death seemed to carry implications that extended far beyond immediate tragedy. The assembled company had provided their accounts with the sort of cooperative courtesy that characterized their class, yet beneath the surface of polite assistance, he detected currents of tension and unspoken knowledge that suggested the real drama was only beginning to unfold within the gracious walls of Windermere House. The gentle fiction of their theatrical afternoon had dissolved into something far more serious, and Alleyn suspected that before this matter reached its conclusion, the careful social arrangements that governed their world would be tested in ways that none of them had anticipated when they gathered for what should have been nothing more than a pleasant rehearsal on a quiet autumn afternoon. The dinner at Windermere that evening possessed the peculiar quality of a social ritual, maintained in the face of circumstances that had rendered its familiar rhythms both necessary and somehow artificial. Lady Windermere presided with her customary grace, though those familiar with her particular manner might have detected a subtle alteration in the way she directed conversation, steering it with perhaps more deliberate care than usual, away from certain subjects while maintaining the appearance of effortless hospitality. Inspector Alleyn had been invited to join them with the sort of courteous inclusion that transformed official presence into something resembling social courtesy, though the underlying tensions of the afternoon remained carefully submerged beneath the practiced rituals of proper dinner conversation. The dining room, with its Sheraton sideboard and collection of ancestral silver, provided an appropriately dignified setting for what had become an unexpectedly complex gathering. Dr. Marsh found herself observing the subtle dynamics of the assembled company with professional interest. The way Captain Stratton's attention gravitated toward Miss Ashford with careful persistence, the manner in which Mrs. Fairfax maintained gentle conversation, while her eyes occasionally drifted toward the empty chair where Mr. Harrington should have been seated, the almost imperceptible precision with which Lady Windermere orchestrated the flow of discussion, all spoke to emotional undercurrents that extended far beyond the immediate tragedy. It was during the interval between courses that Mrs. Fairfax made her observation, delivered with the sort of gentle diffidence that characterized her contributions to conversation. "I have been thinking about poor Mr. Harrington's recent difficulties with sleep. He mentioned it several times during the past fortnight, not complaining, you understand, but seeking perhaps some remedy. Dr. Marsh, I believe he consulted you regarding the matter." Dr. Marsh set down her wine-glass with careful precision. He did mention experiencing some restlessness, though nothing that indicated serious medical concern. "I suggested the usual remedies, regular hours, moderate exercise, perhaps a mild sedative if the difficulty persisted. He seemed reluctant to resort to medication, preferring natural solutions. The exchange carried implications that extended beyond immediate medical discussion. Alleyn noted the way Miss Ashford's fingers had tightened slightly around her water-glass, the manner in which Lady Windermere's gaze had shifted almost imperceptibly toward the window, the careful neutrality with which Dr. Marsh had framed her response. Following dinner, as the company dispersed according to the natural rhythms of country-house routine, Alleyn found himself conducted by Blackwood through the service passages to the butler's private sitting-room. The contrast between this domain and the elegant reception rooms above was instructive. Here, efficiency took precedence over aesthetics, though the room possessed that reassuring cleanliness that spoke of professional pride. "If you please, sir," Blackwood said, indicating a chair that would not have been offered to many from above stairs. His face in repose had the measured neutrality of one who had attended births and deaths and dinner parties for 40 years, and been answerable for none of them. "Your time is valuable, Mr. Blackwood," Alleyn began, settling into the offered chair. "I should like to trouble it as little as possible. What I need are the small things, the ordinary ways of this house, and how they may have been disturbed today." Blackwood inclined his head, recognizing a language he understood. "If I may begin with the telephone call, sir. It came at precisely 4:30. The caller announced himself briefly and asked for her ladyship. I conducted her to the telephone room and remained in the cross passage, as is proper when the instrument is in use." "How long was she absent?" 9 minutes, sir." Blackwood's tone suggested he had counted each one. "And during that interval, the rehearsal company remained in the gallery?" "Yes, sir. I had provided tea service at 10 minutes after 4. Teapot, cups, thin bread and butter, pound cake. For Mr. Harrington specifically, I placed a jug of fresh water and a tumbler at the small table by the pianoforte. He never took tea during rehearsals, sir. Always water." Alleyn noted the precision with which Blackwood recalled these details. "The positioning of the water service. You're particular about such matters?" "Indeed, sir. I set the jug upon a mat precisely aligned with the edge of the table. Later, when assisting the doctors, I observed that the jug had been moved. There was a ring upon the polished wood that did not correspond to where I had placed it." The significance of this small displacement was not lost on Alleyn. Who might have approached the table during Lady Windermere's absence? "I was obliged to the corridor, sir, but I have my staff. Thomas, if you please." A young footman appeared with the uncertain grace of youth not yet accustomed to official attention. At Blackwood's gentle prompting he provided his observations with growing confidence. "Mrs. Fairfax poured tea for Miss Ashford, sir. Miss Ashford took it and stood at the window. Captain Stratton fetched a cushion for Mrs. Fairfax. Dr. Marsh did not take anything. Mr. Harrington already had his water." "And did anyone approach Mr. Harrington's table specifically?" Alleyn inquired. Thomas's eyes brightened with remembered detail. "Miss Ashford set her gloves near the water jug, sir. Pale kid gloves. She retrieved them when she went behind the Chinese screen. And there was a paper, sir, blue paper, tucked under the top sheet of music. I thought Mr. Harrington wouldn't wish it seen, so I meant to mention it to Mr. Blackwood. But then the rehearsal resumed and—" He glanced apologetically at the butler. "When I looked again later, it was gone." This revelation carried considerable weight. Alleyn filed it carefully while maintaining his conversational tone. "You've been most observant, Thomas. Most helpful indeed." After the young man had been dismissed, Alleyn continued his conversation with Blackwood, learning of Harrington's recent irregularities, lights burning at unusual hours, requests for tea service at unexpected times, occasional absences from meals without explanation. The picture that emerged was of a man whose surface conformity to household routines had begun to fracture in subtle but significant ways. "His correspondence was rather voluminous, sir," Blackwood added. "Lawyers on occasion, representatives from publishing houses, matters concerning his affairs, which seemed to require frequent attention despite his apparent independence of means. Mrs. Bristow, the housekeeper, appeared as if summoned by the mention of household irregularities. Her testimony added another layer to the emerging picture. Someone had been near the telephone room during Lady Windermere's conversation, someone whose presence was suggested by a shift of light and the faint scent of orris powder. "We use lavender on the linen, sir," she explained to Alleyn. "Some ladies prefer orris for their personal effects." When Alleyn finally returned to the gallery, now quiet and dimly lit by the dying fire, he stood contemplating the scene with new understanding. The pianoforte remained as it had been left, its keys bearing the final impression of Harrington's hands. The small table bore its telltale ring upon the polished surface, evidence of disturbance in a household where such details mattered profoundly. The house possessed two maps, he reflected, as the portraits gazed down with their eternal judgment. One belonged to those who dined and performed amateur theatricals, the other to those who made such performances possible through invisible service and careful attention to routine. It was in the small deviations from the latter, a moved water jug, a missing blue paper, the scent of orris where lavender was expected, that truth would eventually declare itself. The afternoon's gentle mask had ended, but Alleyn suspected that a far more complex drama was only beginning to unfold within the gracious walls of Windermere House. The question was no longer simply how Geoffrey Harrington had died, but why his death seemed to carry implications that extended far beyond the boundaries of natural tragedy, into territory that would test the careful social arrangements of this particular corner of English country life in ways none of them had anticipated. The morning light possessed that particular quality of English autumn, which seems to acknowledge its own transience, filtering through the tall windows of Windermere with a diffidence that matched the subdued atmosphere pervading the house. Inspector Alleyn had passed a contemplative night in the Blue Room, his mind occupied not with the dramatic gestures of detection, but with those small deviations from routine that often proved more eloquent than any confession. Breakfast in the morning room proceeded with the sort of careful normalcy that characterized households attempting to maintain dignity in the face of extraordinary disruption. Lady Windermere presided with her customary grace, though those familiar with her particular manner might have detected a subtle alteration in the way she directed conversation, steering it with perhaps more deliberate care than usual, away from certain subjects while maintaining the appearance of effortless hospitality. "I believe it would be appropriate to continue with this evening's performance," she announced, her voice carrying that particular note of determined courtesy, which brooked no argument while appearing to invite discussion. "Mr. Harrington would not have wished our charitable obligations to be abandoned on his account. Mrs. Fairfax has kindly agreed to provide musical accompaniment." The decision was received with the sort of polite agreement that masked considerable private reservations. Dr. Marsh nodded with professional understanding, while Captain Stratton accepted his expanded responsibilities with military precision. Miss Ashford maintained her classical composure, though something in her expression suggested preoccupations that extended beyond immediate theatrical concerns. Following breakfast, Alleyn found himself drawn to the domestic heart of Windermere, the still room, where Mrs. Bristow reigned over the mysteries of household perfection with the authority of long practice. The room possessed that chapel-like quality which superior establishments bring to the rituals of daily service, its copper vessels gleaming with religious devotion to cleanliness. "The water service for yesterday's rehearsal," Alleyn began, his tone carrying the conversational ease that transformed official inquiry into something resembling social discourse, "followed the usual pattern." Mrs. Bristow regarded him with the measured attention she reserved for matters touching her professional domain. "Indeed, sir. Spring water from our own cistern, jugs rinsed and polished, tumblers likewise. Mr. Harrington never took lemon, we learned that from the first rehearsal. Thomas carries the tray according to my precise instructions. Any variations yesterday?" She considered with the thoroughness that characterized her approach to all household matters. "Only that I noticed, when clearing afterward, a faint scent that didn't belong. Orris powder, sir. It clings to fine gloves, transfers easily to glass or silver." This observation aligned perfectly with Blackwood's testimony regarding the displaced water jug. Alleyn made his way to the gallery, where morning light revealed details that evening shadows had obscured. The room retained that peculiar quality of spaces where significant events have occurred, an atmosphere of suspended attention, as if the very air held memory. He stood before the pianoforte, observing the small table beside it with renewed attention. The faint ring upon the polished wood told its story of careful placement and subsequent disturbance. Blackwood's precision was legendary. Such displacement spoke to intervention rather than accident. Combined with Thomas's testimony regarding the blue paper, a pattern began to emerge. The music itself bore witness to yesterday's events. The top sheet showed the faint smudge that Thomas had mentioned. Not a musical notation, but the sort of mark that might result from a hastily withdrawn paper leaving its graphite impression. In the shallow cavity beneath the music rest, Alleyn noted the empty brass clip where, according to Blackwood's casual mention, a tuning fork should have resided, one of Harrington's small rituals, tapping the fork before each performance. "Inspector?" Miss Ashford's voice carried across the gallery with that particular blend of diffidence and determination that suggested internal struggle resolved in favour of disclosure. She approached with graceful hesitation, her classical features maintaining their composure while betraying subtle signs of sleepless reflection. "I fear I may not have been entirely forthcoming yesterday," she began, her words chosen with particular care. "During Lady Windermere's absence, I observed Mr. Harrington reading something, a paper that he seemed to take from among his music sheets. His reaction was quite pronounced. He became pale, and his hands trembled as he folded the paper and placed it in his waistcoat pocket. The revelation carried considerable weight, confirming the significance of the missing blue paper. "You observed anything else that might be relevant?" Alleyn inquired, his tone maintaining gentle encouragement. Miss Ashford's response came with visible reluctance. "When I retrieved my gloves from near the water service, I noticed Mr. Harrington's glass contained something more than water. There was a slight effervescence and a faint medicinal odour." This observation suggested possibilities that extended far beyond simple coincidence. Alleyn's subsequent examination of Harrington's room, conducted with Blackwood's assistance, revealed additional elements to the emerging picture. Among the papers arranged with characteristic precision lay a letter from a London firm of solicitors, a communication regarding contested inheritance matters that carried unmistakable undertones of suspicion regarding document authenticity. On the corner of the blotter sat a chemist's envelope of pale blue, empty but bearing the violet-inked label, chloral hydrate, 3 grains, at bedtime. The prescription spoke to legitimate medical treatment for the sleeplessness Harrington had mentioned, yet its presence raised questions about the sequence of events leading to his death. The wastepaper basket yielded its own small revelation, the torn corner of blue notepaper bearing half a word in cheap purple ink, morrow. The fragment suggested correspondence of some urgency, perhaps connected to the legal matters that had clearly been weighing upon Harrington's mind. Returning to the gallery, Alleyn conducted his own quiet reconstruction of yesterday's events. The precise placement of the water jug, the careful arrangement of music, the small rituals that had governed Harrington's performance, all had been subtly disrupted. The missing tuning fork, the displaced jug, the absent blue paper, these deviations from routine spoke to intervention during those crucial minutes of Lady Windermere's absence. The scent of orris powder, detected by Mrs. Bristow's experienced nose, provided a connecting thread. Alleyn's discreet observation had noted this particular fragrance associated with Miss Ashford, whose movements during the rehearsal had brought her into proximity with both the water service and the music stand. Yet the emerging pattern suggested not malicious intent, but rather the sort of desperate improvisation that circumstances sometimes demand of otherwise respectable people. The inheritance letter, the mysterious blue paper, the medicinal preparation in the water glass. These elements pointed to a sequence of events more complex than simple theatrical tragedy. As morning progressed toward the responsibilities of the day, Alleyn found himself confronting not merely the question of how Geoffrey Harrington had died, but the considerably more delicate matter of why his death had occurred at precisely the moment when certain papers required removal, certain evidence demanded elimination, and certain secrets needed protection. The gentle mask of Winter's Grace had provided unwitting cover for a drama whose complexity was only beginning to reveal itself. The real performance, Alleyn suspected, was yet to reach its climax within the gracious walls of Windermere House, where elegance masked necessity and politeness concealed the sort of pressures that could drive even the most refined individuals to actions they would never have contemplated under ordinary circumstances. The afternoon would bring its own revelations, and evening would test the careful social arrangements that had brought this particular assembly together in ways none of them had anticipated when they gathered for what should have been nothing more than a pleasant rehearsal on a quiet autumn day. The afternoon possessed that peculiar quality of enforced normalcy which follows tragedy in well-ordered households, where the machinery of daily life must continue despite the intrusion of death into carefully maintained routines. At Windermere, the preparations for the evening's charitable performance proceeded with heightened precision, as if the very act of maintaining schedule could somehow contain the unsettling implications of Mr. Harrington's sudden passing within acceptable boundaries. Inspector Alleyn, returning to conduct a more thorough examination of Harrington's quarters, discovered what he had half expected yet hoped not to find. The small chemist's envelope that had rested on the corner of the blotter, bearing its violet-inked prescription for chloral hydrate, had vanished as silently as morning mist. The absence was not dramatic. It was simply a void where evidence had once resided, a careful erasure that spoke more eloquently than any confession. He stood contemplating this development when Blackwood appeared in the doorway with that mysterious promptness which superior servants cultivate. The butler's expression maintained its customary discretion, though his experienced eyes immediately comprehended the significance of Alleyn's attention to the empty space upon the blotter. The envelope was present when I assisted Dr. Morrison this morning, Blackwood confirmed, with characteristic precision. I noted its position specifically, as is my habit with any item that might require official attention. It has been undisturbed since, save for this apparent removal. The implications settled between them with the weight of shared understanding. Someone within the house possessed both access and motivation sufficient to risk such deliberate interference with evidence. The action suggested not panic but calculated necessity, the sort of quiet desperation that drives otherwise respectable individuals to measures they would never contemplate under ordinary circumstances. In the library, Lady Windermere received Alleyn with that particular blend of courtesy and resignation which characterised her approach to unpleasant necessities. She had arranged herself with customary grace beside the fire, yet something in her posture, a subtle rigidity in her shoulders, a careful precision in her movements, suggested internal tension imperfectly controlled. "Inspector," she began, her voice carrying that note of aristocratic confession which acknowledges omission while maintaining dignity, "I fear there are matters regarding yesterday's telephone call that I should have mentioned earlier. Not from any desire to mislead, you understand, but from uncertainty regarding their relevance to poor Mr. Harrington's tragic circumstances." Her revelation proceeded with measured reluctance. The London communication had concerned not merely the evening's patron arrangements, but specific inquiries regarding documents in Harrington's possession, family papers relating to inheritance matters that had been considered conclusively settled years previous. Questions had been raised regarding the authenticity of certain instruments, wills and codicils that formed the foundation of Harrington's modest independence. "Such proceedings can prove most unpleasant," Lady Windermere continued, her fingers worrying at her pearls with uncharacteristic restlessness. "They involve not merely financial considerations, but questions of character, competence, and family honour. Mr. Harrington had been increasingly distressed by these developments over recent weeks." The conversation was interrupted by Dr. Morrison's arrival, bearing the results of his more thorough medical examination. His findings confirmed the presence of chloral hydrate in quantities that, while not dramatically excessive, had proven unexpectedly potent when combined with Harrington's recent cardiac irregularities and emotional strain. The death remained natural in mechanism, yet the circumstances suggested possibilities that extended beyond simple medical tragedy. As afternoon progressed toward evening, the gallery underwent its transformation from rehearsal space to performance venue. The cast moved through their preparations with heightened awareness, each gesture carrying implications that extended far beyond theatrical necessity. Miss Ashford's classical composure showed signs of strain, her movements acquiring a brittle precision that suggested emotions held in check through considerable effort of will. Captain Stratton attended her with protective solicitude, his military bearing somehow more pronounced, as if he had resolved upon a course of action requiring particular courage. It was during this interval of preparation that Blackwood brought to Alleyn's attention a communication that had arrived by village messenger, a letter bearing the letterhead of Merrion and Pike, solicitors, requesting immediate dispatch of Harrington's personal papers to avoid complications with probate proceedings. The correspondence possessed surface authenticity, yet closer examination revealed subtle inconsistencies, an incorrect telephone exchange, violet ink where the firm habitually employed black and paper of quality beneath their usual standards. The forged communication carried the faint scent of orris powder, that particular fragrance which Mrs. Bristow had noted as foreign to Windermere's domestic arrangements. Combined with the village boy's description of his employer, a veiled lady in a light motor car who paid in coin and spoke with refined accents, the pattern suggested desperate improvisation rather than calculated malice. Mrs. Fairfax, arranging her music at the pianoforte with quiet capability, provided another piece to the emerging puzzle. She had noted among Harrington's sheets a half-page of blue paper, tucked between movements of the saraband. Not musical notation, but what appeared to be personal correspondence that had required his immediate attention during rehearsal. He seemed quite affected by whatever it contained, she observed with gentle precision. His playing afterward carried a quality of distraction that was most unlike his usual careful attention to detail. As evening light faded beyond the tall windows and the first guests began arriving for the charitable performance, Alleyn found himself in possession of a sequence of events that suggested not premeditated murder, but rather the sort of desperate measures that fear of exposure can inspire. The blue paper had carried information demanding immediate response, perhaps notification of impending investigation, perhaps evidence of document irregularities that threatened reputation and financial security. The addition of chloral hydrate to Harrington's water appeared intended as temporary incapacitation rather than permanent solution, a means of preventing some immediate action, buying time for alternative arrangements. The fatal outcome had been miscalculation rather than design, the tragic result of amateur pharmacology applied under pressure of circumstances. Yet proving such a sequence required more than circumstantial evidence. It demanded understanding not merely of actions but of motivations, not simply of what had occurred, but why it had been deemed necessary. The evening's performance would provide an appropriate setting for such revelations, where the careful social arrangements that governed their world would be tested in ways none of them had anticipated. The real drama, Alleyn suspected, was yet to reach its climax within the gracious walls of Windermere House, where elegance masked desperation and politeness concealed pressures that could drive even the most refined individuals to actions whose consequences extended far beyond their original intentions. The gentle mask of Winter's Grace would serve as backdrop to a far more complex performance, one in which the players had no script, and the outcome remained uncertain until the final curtain fell. The evening descended upon Windermere with that particular quality of English autumn twilight which seems to acknowledge both ending and beginning, casting the great house in shadows that transformed familiar spaces into something more theatrical, more charged with possibility. The gallery had undergone its final transformation from rehearsal space to performance venue. The Persian carpets arranged with ceremonial precision to accommodate the county's better families, all gathered ostensibly in support of the hospital fund, though the undercurrents of curiosity regarding yesterday's tragedy provided a more compelling draw than charitable obligation alone. Inspector Alleyn moved through the preparations with that grave courtesy which seemed to reconcile the duties of authority with the unspoken rules of good breeding. His afternoon's discoveries had yielded their quiet revelations. The tuning fork, engraved with Harrington's modest initials, found tucked behind the wainscoting where ritual objects had no business residing. The faint traces of orris powder along the carved newel post, easily brushed away yet eloquent in their displacement. The hairline scratch on the telephone room's polished table, where an elbow had pressed too urgently during yesterday's crucial conversation. Dr. Morrison's final medical assessment had provided the clinical framework that transformed suspicion into certainty. Chloral in the stomach, yes, he had confirmed with professional finality. Not excessive, but combined with bicarbonate for effervescence. If the heart were not in perfect condition, and recent strain suggests it was not, sleep could prove a very deep river indeed. The image was both poetic and precise, capturing the delicate balance between therapeutic intention and fatal miscalculation. Lady Windermere received her guests with characteristic grace, though those familiar with her particular manner might have detected the subtle rigidity in her shoulders that spoke of internal tensions carefully controlled. Her introduction carried the sort of graceful acknowledgement of tragedy that transformed absence into tribute, while maintaining the evening's charitable purpose. "We gather not merely in support of our worthy cause," she announced, "but in memory of our dear friend Mr. Geoffrey Harrington, whose musical talents graced these walls with such distinction." The assembled audience received this dedication with appropriate solemnity, their murmured appreciation carrying that particular note of respect which English society reserves for the recently deceased. Yet beneath the surface courtesy, Alleyn detected the sharper current of speculation that characterised communities when private matters threatened to become public knowledge. Mrs. Fairfax approached the pianoforte with quiet competence, her gentle manner concealing considerable musical capability. The absence of Harrington's familiar presence at the instrument created a void that extended beyond mere practical consideration. It served as a constant reminder of the tragedy that had brought them to this particular configuration of circumstances. Her opening notes filled the gallery with graceful authority, transforming drawing room into stage through the alchemy of performance. Miss Ashford's preparation for her entrance revealed the strain that careful composure could no longer entirely conceal. In the anteroom, as Mrs. Fairfax fastened a clasp at her shoulder, Alleyn observed the classical features that slight disturbance revealed rather than marred. When she turned to acknowledge his presence, her smile carried that particular quality of determined brightness which suggested emotions held in check through considerable effort of will. "You will forgive me if I seem preoccupied," she murmured, her voice maintaining its cultivated modulation. "One ought to be equal to such occasions, but one is only human." "Indeed," Alleyn replied, noting the pristine kid gloves she wore. New, or newly substituted, carrying that distinctive scent of orris, which Mrs. Bristow had identified as foreign to Windermere's domestic arrangements. "I had meant to ask whether you favour orris for your gloves. It is a scent one associates with, well, good habits." The faint flush that coloured her cheeks provided confirmation beyond words. "It is convenient for gloves. Everything else seems intrusive. I am not fond of heavy perfumes." Her response carried the careful precision of truth shaped by necessity, acknowledging the fact while deflecting its implications. Captain Stratton's arrival in the corridor brought with it that particular quality of protective vigilance which characterised his attention to Miss Ashford's welfare. His bearing suggested a man who had resolved upon a course of action requiring considerable courage, though whether that courage extended to full knowledge of the circumstances remained unclear. "She has been distressed about a matter not entirely germane," he confided to Alleyn with military directness. "If her manner if she appears—" "We will allow her every courtesy," Alleyn assured him, recognising in Stratton's steadfastness an acceptance of responsibility that sounded remarkably like a pledge of protection, regardless of cost. The performance commenced with Miss Ashford's entrance as Lady Cordelia, her costume of pale blue silk catching the lamplight with ethereal radiance, yet her interpretation of the role carried an intensity that went beyond theatrical requirement, as if the evening's events had acquired personal significance extending far beyond charitable entertainment. Her delivery of the crucial recognition scene possessed a quality of desperate beauty that transformed scripted allegory into something approaching personal confession. "The shadows that have held dominion over this realm," she declared, her gaze encompassing both immediate audience and watching portraits, "must yield to truth's illuminating power. What has been hidden shall be revealed. What has been whispered shall be proclaimed, and what has been feared shall be faced with courage rather than concealment." The words, crafted by Lady Windermere as seasonal metaphor, seemed to carry implications that extended far beyond their original context. Several members of the audience shifted uncomfortably, sensing undercurrents they could not quite identify, while Captain Stratton's response as Lord Aubrey carried protective concern that suggested he understood the personal weight behind his partner's performance. During the interval, Alleyn employed a strategic deception that his afternoon's investigations had suggested. Through Blackwood's discreet communication to the staff, word spread below stairs that a certain blue paper had been partially recovered and awaited identification in the morning. The information, carefully calibrated to create pressure without panic, would serve to illuminate reactions among those who had reason to fear such discovery. As the masque approached its climax, the assembled company found themselves witnessing not merely charitable entertainment, but the culmination of emotional pressures that had been building since yesterday's tragedy. The evening's performance had become a stage upon which real drama was beginning to declare itself with increasing clarity, though the final revelation remained suspended in that delicate balance between suspicion and certainty that characterised the most complex of human mysteries. The gentle fiction of their theatrical evening was drawing toward its close, but Alleyn suspected that the more significant performance, the one in which the players had no script and the outcome remained uncertain, was approaching its most crucial scenes within the gracious walls of Windermere House, where elegance masked desperation and politeness concealed the sort of pressures that could drive even the most refined individuals to actions whose consequences extended far beyond their original desperate intentions. The final notes of Winter's grace faded into the sort of appreciative silence that precedes polite applause, and Windermere seemed to exhale with collective relief. The evening had achieved its delicate balance, charitable obligation fulfilled, social proprieties maintained, and the shadow of recent tragedy acknowledged without overwhelming the gracious fiction of a normalcy. As guests began their gradual departure, exchanging the customary pleasantries that mark successful country entertainments, Inspector Alleyn observed the subtle choreography of leave-taking with the attention that had become second nature to his profession. Miss Ashford received congratulations with that particular blend of gratitude and exhaustion which characterised amateur performers who had exceeded their own expectations. Her portrayal of Lady Cordelia had possessed an intensity that transcended mere theatrical requirement, as if the evening's allegorical themes had acquired personal significance extending far beyond seasonal metaphor. Captain Stratton remained at her side with protective solicitude, his bearing suggesting both admiration for her performance and concern for the strain it had evidently cost her. It was during the interval of polite farewells that Alleyn employed the strategic revelation he had prepared throughout his afternoon's investigations. Drawing Miss Ashford aside with the sort of courteous discretion that transformed official inquiry into something resembling social conversation, he produced from his waistcoat pocket a fragment of blue paper. Not the original document, which remained missing, but a carefully prepared substitute that carried the essential visual elements of authenticity. "I believe this may have some connection to Mr. Harrington's recent correspondence," he observed, his tone maintaining that conversational ease which invited confidence rather than defensiveness. It was discovered wedged beneath the music stand, apparently overlooked during yesterday's tragic circumstances. The effect was immediate and unmistakable. Miss Ashford's carefully maintained composure fractured with visible shock, her gloved hands trembling as she recognised not the specific content but the significance of blue paper bearing violet ink, elements that struck at the heart of her carefully concealed desperation. The fragment bore no actual text, yet its implications carried the weight of revelation. "I don't understand," she whispered, though her expression suggested comprehension that extended far beyond her words. What could such a paper have to do with poor Mr. Harrington's death? Lady Windermere, observing this exchange with a sort of aristocratic perception that missed little within her own domain, approached with measured concern. "Inspector, perhaps this matter might be discussed more privately. The library would be appropriate, I believe." The library, with its leather-bound volumes and familiar portraits, provided the intimate setting that such revelations required. Captain Stratton, invited to remain at Miss Ashford's visible request, positioned himself with that protective vigilance which suggested both personal attachment and moral obligation. Dr. Marsh, whose professional presence had been quietly requested, completed the small assembly that would witness the unravelling of yesterday's tragedy. "Miss Ashford," Alleyn began, settling into the chair Lady Windermere indicated, "I believe you received certain distressing information yesterday. Information that suggested Mr. Harrington possessed documents that could prove ruinous to someone whose welfare you valued above your own safety." Her response came with the halting precision of truth long withheld. The blue paper had indeed contained devastating intelligence. Formal notification that Harrington's genealogical research had uncovered irregularities in certain inheritance documents, specifically those establishing the legitimacy of Lady Windermere's family's claim to properties that had provided their foundation for generations. The investigation, initially academic in nature, had revealed forged signatures and altered dates that called into question not merely financial arrangements, but the very honour of the Windermere name. "The documents were created years ago," she explained, her voice carrying desperate conviction, "when the original papers were damaged by fire. The alterations were intended to preserve legitimate claims, not to create false ones, but the legal implications would have been catastrophic regardless of original intent." The revelation illuminated the pressures that had driven her to desperate measures. Lady Windermere's reputation, the family's standing, their charitable works, all would have been destroyed by public exposure of the document irregularities, however innocent their original motivation. Harrington's academic curiosity had inadvertently uncovered information that threatened to destroy not merely financial security, but the social fabric that had sustained the Windermere legacy for generations. "The chloral hydrate," Alleyn continued with gentle persistence, "was intended to prevent Mr. Harrington from taking immediate action regarding his discoveries, a temporary incapacitation that would provide opportunity for alternative arrangements, perhaps private discussion, some accommodation that would protect Lady Windermere while satisfying Mr. Harrington's scholarly integrity." Her confession proceeded with increasing clarity, each revelation carrying the weight of genuine remorse. The sleeping powder, obtained through Dr. Marsh's legitimate prescription for occasional use, had been added to Harrington's water during Lady Windermere's crucial absence from the gallery. The bicarbonate had been included to disguise the bitter taste while ensuring rapid absorption. The fatal outcome had been miscalculation rather than malicious intent, the tragic result of amateur pharmacology applied under pressure of circumstances she felt powerless to resolve through conventional means. "I never intended harm," she whispered, her composure finally dissolving into tears that carried authentic anguish. "I thought only to buy time, to prevent immediate action until some solution could be found. I could not bear to see Lady Windermere's family destroyed by circumstances beyond anyone's control." Captain Stratton's response carried the sort of quiet dignity that characterized his approach to crisis. "Daphne," he said, his voice steady despite visible emotion, "you should have trusted that some burdens are meant to be shared, not borne alone." Lady Windermere, who had listened to these revelations with the grave attention that tragedy demands, finally spoke with characteristic authority tempered by profound sadness. "My dear child, no consideration of family honour could justify the risk you undertook on our behalf. The Windermere name has survived greater challenges than questions of ancient paperwork." Alleyn's response carried that quality of measured judgment which balanced justice with understanding of human frailty. "The matter will require careful consideration. The death was unintentional, the circumstances exceptional, and the motivation, however tragically misguided, stemmed from loyalty rather than malice. Such cases demand wisdom rather than mere adherence to legal technicalities." As the October night deepened beyond the tall windows, the assembled company found themselves confronting not merely the consequences of tragedy, but the complex moral landscape that surrounds actions taken in desperation by otherwise honourable individuals. The gentle mask of winter's grace had concluded, but the more serious drama, the one in which real people faced real consequences for choices made under impossible pressure, was approaching its own resolution within the gracious walls that had witnessed both their theatrical triumph and their personal catastrophe. The truth had finally declared itself with the quiet authority that characterizes the most profound revelations, yet questions of justice, mercy, and the delicate balance between public duty and private compassion remained to be resolved in the cold light of morning that would soon illuminate the ancient stones of Windermere House. The morning that followed Miss Ashford's confession possessed that peculiar quality of English autumn light which seems to acknowledge both ending and beginning, filtering through the tall windows of Windermere with a diffidence that matched the altered atmosphere pervading the house. The library, where truth had finally declared itself in the quiet hours before dawn, now served as the chamber where consequence must be carefully measured against compassion, and where the machinery of justice would be set in motion with all the discretion that superior households could bring to bear upon extraordinary circumstances. Inspector Alleyn regarded the assembled company with that grave courtesy which had characterized his investigation from its beginning. The fire had been made up to a judicious glow, and Blackwood had arranged the morning service with particular attention to comfort, understanding that the rituals of hospitality would provide necessary anchor points during the difficult conversations that lay ahead. Lady Windermere maintained her position near the writing table with characteristic dignity, though those familiar with her particular manner might have detected the subtle alteration in her posture that spoke of burdens accepted rather than imposed. "The evidence," Alleyn began, his voice carrying that measured authority which transformed official inquiry into something approaching scholarly discourse, "forms a pattern that admits of little ambiguity. The blue paper, bearing notification of Mr. Harrington's intention to proceed with formal investigation into certain family documents, provided the catalyst for desperate action. Miss Ashford's proximity to the water service during Lady Windermere's absence, combined with her access to legitimately prescribed chloral hydrate, created the opportunity for what was intended as temporary incapacitation rather than permanent harm." He drew from his waistcoat pocket the small collection of evidence that, considered together, told their quiet but exorable story. The fragment of blue paper from the wastebasket, the chemist's envelope that Blackwood had discovered scorched in the still-room tidy, and the modest tuning fork that had been displaced during the afternoon's tragic events. Each item spoke to the sequence of desperate improvisation that had transformed a gentle rehearsal into something far more serious. Miss Ashford received this methodical reconstruction with a sort of composed attention that suggested acceptance rather than hope for contradiction. Her classical features bore the unmistakable marks of genuine anguish, yet beneath the surface emotion lay a strength of character that had sustained her through the terrible isolation of her secret knowledge. When she spoke, her voice carried the steady quality of one who had moved beyond deception into the clearer air of acknowledged truth. "The orris powder," she observed with careful precision, "transferred from my gloves to the water jug when I approached Mr. Harrington's table. Mrs. Bristow's trained nose detected what I had hoped would pass unnoticed. Such small details become significant when examined with proper attention." Captain Stratton, who had maintained his protective vigil throughout the long night, stepped forward with that controlled precision which military service had refined into instinct. "Inspector," he said, his voice carrying quiet determination, "whatever Miss Ashford faces in the coming proceedings, she will not face alone. I consider it both privilege and duty to provide whatever support circumstances permit." His declaration carried implications that extended far beyond immediate legal necessity into territory where personal honour intersected with romantic attachment. The assembled company understood that he was offering not merely emotional support, but a formal commitment that would bind their futures together, regardless of official consequences. Lady Windermere, who had listened to these exchanges with the grave attention that tragedy demands, finally spoke with characteristic authority tempered by profound personal responsibility. "Inspector, I believe it essential that you understand the full context of these tragic events. The document irregularities that so distressed Mr. Harrington stem from alterations made 2 generations ago, following a fire that damaged the original papers. The modifications were intended to preserve legitimate claims rather than create false ones, but I have long understood that legal technicalities might not recognise such distinctions." Her confession carried the weight of aristocratic accountability, acknowledging that the pressures which had driven Miss Ashford to desperate measures originated in circumstances for which the Windermere family bore ultimate responsibility. "I shall place our papers entirely at the disposal of the proper authorities," she continued. "Whatever obligations arise from this investigation shall be met with complete cooperation." Dr. Marsh, whose professional experience had acquainted her with the complex relationship between medical fact and human circumstance, provided the clinical perspective that would prove essential to any resolution. The chloral dosage, while ultimately fatal in combination with Mr. Harrington's cardiac condition, was entirely consistent with therapeutic rather than lethal intent. The addition of bicarbonate suggests concern for palatability rather than concealment of murderous purpose. These distinctions will prove significant in determining appropriate legal frameworks. As the morning progressed toward the practical necessities that tragedy demands, Blackwood appeared with that mysterious promptness which superior servants cultivate. His subsequent arrangements, communications managed, household routines maintained despite extraordinary disruption, guest accommodations prepared with meticulous attention to dignity, provided the stable foundation upon which more complex considerations could be addressed. "The coroner will require formal statements," Alleyn explained, his tone maintaining gentle authority, while acknowledging the emotional costs such procedures would exact. "Miss Ashford, your account must describe intentions with complete precision, while omitting nothing that touches upon Mr. Harrington's death or the subsequent removal of evidence. The circumstances surrounding your actions, however, will be presented with full consideration for their complexity." The practical arrangements proceeded with characteristic Windermere efficiency. Mrs. Bristow's quiet provision of appropriate refreshment served dual purposes of physical comfort and psychological reassurance, while the maintenance of proper service rituals provided continuity that proved more valuable than mere convenience. The household, informed through Lady Windermere's careful explanation, received the intelligence with professional composure that 40 years of superior service had refined into art. As the October morning advanced toward its responsibilities, the assembled company found themselves confronting not merely the immediate consequences of Miss Ashford's confession, but the larger questions of how human frailty intersects with moral obligation, and how the machinery of justice might accommodate the complex realities of desperate loyalty, transformed into tragic miscalculation. The truth had declared itself with quiet authority, yet its accommodation within the larger fabric of law and mercy remained to be determined by careful navigation of legal procedures, social consequences, and the fundamental human capacity for both error and redemption. The gentle mask of Winter's Grace had concluded, but its themes of hidden truth emerging into light seemed to acquire prophetic significance as the real drama approached its final resolution within the gracious walls of Windermere House. The coroner's inquiry convened in the long parlour of the rectory, a compromise between propriety and necessity that satisfied the requirements of law without subjecting the village to unnecessary spectacle. The room, with its scarred oak table and rows of sober chairs arranged with careful precision, had witnessed many parish deliberations, but seldom one so delicately poised between private sorrow and public duty. The attendance was limited by discretion, Dr. Morrison, Dr. Marsh, Blackwood representing the household, and those whose presence the law deemed unavoidable. Lady Windermere occupied a chair beside the tall window, her bearing maintaining that quality of composed authority which transformed official proceedings into something approaching dignified discourse. Inspector Alleyn positioned himself with characteristic unobtrusiveness, his presence lending gravity without dominating the careful choreography of rural justice. The fire had been laid with particular attention to comfort, understanding that the rituals of hospitality would provide necessary anchor points during conversations that must balance truth with compassion, legal requirement with human understanding. Dr. Morrison's testimony established the medical framework with professional thoroughness tempered by gentle humanity. His voice, carrying that particular blend of authority and regret which characterized country physicians faced with preventable tragedy, described the condition of Harrington's heart. Not diseased in any gross sense, but susceptible to sudden strain, and the quantity of chloral hydrate discovered in the post-mortem examination. Therapeutic in isolation, he explained with careful precision, but dangerous in combination with cardiac irregularity and recent emotional distress. The bicarbonate employed for palatability suggests concern for comfort rather than concealment of harmful intent. Dr. Marsh's corroboration provided essential clinical perspective, her testimony carrying the weight of professional expertise combined with personal observation of the circumstances. She spoke of chloral hydrate's legitimate medical applications, the dosage consistent with therapeutic rather than lethal purpose, and the tragic miscalculation that had transformed intended kindness into fatal consequence. When Miss Ashford was called to give her account, she approached the witness chair with that composed dignity which had sustained her through the long week since her confession. Her testimony, delivered without ornament or appeal for sympathy, possessed the unmistakable ring of authentic remorse. She described her distress upon learning of Harrington's genealogical discoveries, her fear for Lady Windermere's family honour, and her impulsive decision to prevent immediate action through temporary incapacitation. "I believed," she stated with careful precision, her voice steady despite visible emotion, that rendering Mr. Harrington unconscious for a brief period would provide opportunity for private discussion, some accommodation that might protect Lady Windermere while satisfying scholarly integrity. The fatal outcome was entirely contrary to my intentions, which were motivated by loyalty rather than malice. The coroner's questions, posed with that blend of thoroughness and delicacy which English jurisprudence brings to cases involving the better classes, elicited additional details regarding the sequence of events. The blue paper bearing notification of Harrington's intention to proceed with formal investigation, the brief opportunity during Lady Windermere's absence from the gallery, the careful addition of bicarbonate to mask the bitter taste, each element spoke to desperate improvisation rather than calculated murder. Captain Stratton's presence throughout these proceedings provided silent testimony to his unwavering commitment. When invited to speak regarding Miss Ashford's character, his military bearing lent considerable weight to his declaration that her actions, however tragically misguided, stemmed from the finest instincts of loyalty and service. "I have observed Miss Ashford under circumstances of considerable strain," he stated with quiet authority, "and I can attest that her conduct has been consistently motivated by concern for others rather than personal advantage." Lady Windermere's testimony regarding the document irregularities provided essential context for understanding the pressures that had driven Miss Ashford to such desperate measures. Her voluntary submission of all family papers to official scrutiny, combined with her offer to make financial restitution for any disputed claims, demonstrated the sort of aristocratic accountability that impressed even those predisposed to skepticism regarding inherited privilege. The coroner's summing possessed that cautious humanity which characterized his long experience with rural tragedy. He had before him, he observed, a death whose mechanism was clear, whose intention was tragically mistaken rather than malignant, and whose origin lay in misguided loyalty rather than criminal purpose. The evidence supported neither willful murder nor deliberate harm, but rather the sort of desperate miscalculation that pressure and affection could drive decent people to commit. "Death by misadventure," he pronounced after careful deliberation, adding a formal caution regarding the administration of medicinal substances by those unqualified to prescribe them, while acknowledging the absence of malice and the presence of genuine remorse. There would be no committal for trial. The matter, as far as the Crown was concerned, would rest with this finding. The room emptied with the same discretion that had characterised its filling. Conversations conducted in undertones that respected both the gravity of the proceedings and the dignity of those involved. Outside, the rectory garden bore the marks of advancing winter, and the familiar sounds of village life resumed their gentle rhythm, as if acknowledging that even tragedy must eventually yield to the persistent demands of ordinary existence. In the days that followed, the practical arrangements proceeded with characteristic Windermere efficiency. Lady Windermere's correspondence with the London solicitors resulted in a meeting conducted under independent supervision, where document irregularities were acknowledged and appropriate restitution arranged. A substantial endowment to the county hospital, established in Harrington's memory, served not as purchase of absolution, but as recognition that some debts extend beyond the merely legal into territory, where conscience must serve as final arbiter. Miss Ashford's engagement to Captain Stratton, announced with understated formality that belied the tumultuous circumstances of its genesis, provided the romantic resolution that observers had anticipated throughout the proceedings. Their union would be founded not upon illusion, but upon shared understanding of human frailty and the courage required to build happiness upon the ruins of tragedy. As winter settled over Windermere with that particular quality of English seasonal transition which seems to acknowledge both ending and renewal, the assembled company found themselves confronting the complex process of rebuilding lives disrupted by desperate decisions made under impossible pressure. The gentle mask of winter's grace had provided unwitting backdrop to real drama, whose resolution required not theatrical gesture, but the patient work of forgiveness, understanding, and the gradual restoration of trust that had been temporarily shattered by circumstances none of them had anticipated, when they gathered for what should have been nothing more than a pleasant rehearsal on a quiet autumn afternoon. The spring that followed brought to Windermere that particular quality of English renewal which seems to acknowledge both continuity and transformation, the ancient stones warming beneath. April sunlight that carried promises of restoration without erasure of memory. Inspector Alleyn, whose return to the district on unrelated business provided opportunity for what might charitably be termed a social call, found the great house settled into its customary rhythms with that remarkable capacity for absorption which characterises establishments that have weathered centuries of both triumph and tragedy. The long gallery had resumed its role as repository of ancestral portraits, though the pianoforte now bore a small brass plate commemorating Geoffrey Harrington's contributions to the musical life of the district. Mrs. Fairfax had arranged a modest wreath of spring flowers beside the music stand, rosemary for remembrance and early violets whose fragrance would provide gentle testimony to lives that continue beyond their earthly conclusion. The Persian carpets lay precisely arranged, their patterns speaking to an order restored yet subtly altered by experience. Lady Windermere received him in the morning room with that blend of genuine warmth and aristocratic courtesy which had sustained her through the winter's difficult proceedings. The document irregularities that had precipitated such tragedy had been resolved through methods satisfying both legal requirement and family honour. Independent investigation had confirmed her account of the alterations, modifications made in good faith following fire damage, intended to preserve legitimate claims rather than create fraudulent ones. The financial adjustments, while substantial, had been managed without compromising the estate's essential character or charitable obligations. "The matter has been concluded with dignity and tact," she observed, settling into her accustomed chair with graceful authority. "Mr. Harrington's scholarship shall be properly established, a chair in genealogical research at the County Historical Society, funded through our arrangements. There is, I find, a justice that can be enacted in committee rooms and ledgers, and another that resides in the quieter chambers of conscience." Through the tall windows, the park revealed Captain and Mrs. Stratton walking with companionable ease that spoke to marriage founded upon shared understanding rather than romantic illusion alone. Their wedding, celebrated in the village church with modest ceremony and genuine celebration, had provided the community with opportunity to demonstrate its capacity for both judgment and forgiveness. Miss Ashford, now Mrs. Stratton, had faced the social consequences of her actions with dignity that commanded respect, even from those initially inclined to censure. "They have taken the cottage near the common," Lady Windermere continued. "Mrs. Stratton has established a small school for village children, practical education rather than mere accomplishment. Her husband's pension, combined with modest inheritance, provides sufficient independence. She maintains her musical interest through the church choir, though she has forsworn orris powder entirely. The last observation carried that particular note of gentle irony which characterised Lady Windermere's approach to life's more complex arrangements. Dr. Marsh, whose professional competence had been enhanced rather than diminished by her involvement in the tragedy's resolution, had expanded her practice to include neighbouring villages. Her combination of medical expertise and social understanding had proved invaluable in a district where professional service required navigation of complex personal relationships as well as clinical skill. Her presence that morning, ostensibly to attend Mrs. Fairfax's mild bronchial complaint, provided opportunity for the sort of informal consultation that rural practice demanded. "The chloral incident has proven instructive regarding amateur pharmacology," she observed during their conversation. "I have established more rigorous protocols regarding prescription security while maintaining accessibility for legitimate need. The balance requires constant attention, but experience refines judgment considerably." Alleyn reflected upon the peculiar nature of cases where human complexity defied simple categorization. This had been a particularly English mystery, lacking the raw passion of violent crime but steeped in the nuances of class, the unspoken rules of decorum and the subtle currents of psychological pressure beneath polished surfaces. The investigation had revealed not criminal calculation but tragic error, not malicious intent but misguided loyalty, not evil triumphant but human frailty accommodated within frameworks of justice tempered by understanding. The final revelation had emerged through patient accumulation of small details: displaced water jugs and missing papers, orris powder and violet ink, the subtle deviations from routine that spoke more eloquently than any confession. The art of detection, he reflected, lay not in forcing truth from reluctant witnesses, but in creating circumstances where truth could declare itself with dignity and tact. In such a world where much remained unsaid and emotions were meticulously veiled, truth often resided in quiet dislocations, the slight trembling of a gloved hand, the careful precision of verbal evasion, the absence of familiar ritual. Walking through the grounds toward his waiting motor car, Alleyn paused at the memorial garden Lady Windermere had established in Harrington's memory. The modest plot, bordered by herbs whose seasonal fragrance would provide gentle variation, bore a simple stone tablet: "Geoffrey Harrington, scholar and musician, whose love of truth enriched our community." The inscription managed to honour the man while acknowledging the complexity of his final circumstances, recognition that human beings possessed capacity for both error and nobility. As his motor carried him away from Windermere toward other duties, other mysteries, Alleyn reflected that this case had concluded not with triumph, but with the quiet satisfaction that comes when justice accommodates the full complexity of human motivation. The gentle mask of Winter's Grace had ended, but its themes of hidden truth emerging into light had acquired permanent significance within walls where tragedy had been transformed, through patience and understanding, into something approaching wisdom. The whispers that had once carried secrets now spoke only of renewal, and in the gallery where portraits maintained their eternal watch, the afternoon light fell with the gentle authority of time itself, patient, persistent, and ultimately merciful to those who learned, however painfully, the true cost of the choices that define us.